Book 9 and 10 of the Iliad reveal the true nature of society and how we interact within the various subsystems operating to keep civilization functioning as a whole. Government, work, commerce, all these systems are subject to the same operating limits or overarching parameters like the amount of physical time we have in a day. Basically, the time it takes the Earth to, rotate once around itself. This is a foundation of our society. But within these confines of the physical laws of nature, we have the ability to craft our own world with our own laws that are explicated in a common language that we understand through an educational or religious process. For thousands of years, time has had a trio of influences on man, with the chthonic earth ruling the day, the moon presiding over the lunar month, and the sun at the center of the solar year. And in tandem or in trios, these various bodies work and interact together to bring us the dimensions of time, or at least how we perceive them, where both the day and the lunar months are where the Egyptians derived the duodecimal system, or the basing of the numbers on the number 12, instead of the 10 that we have in our modern decimal system. So you have two 12-hour halves to the day, the night and day, and 12 lunar months in a year. Although the number 13 could be used for both like some kind of daylight saving time or adding an extra month onto the year to compensate for the tendency of the calendar to drift in the past because it wasn't as accurate. Perhaps this is how the number 13 became to be seen as unlucky. Furthermore, the time could be measured by the sun on a sundial by using the shadow cast, and during the night you could use the stars, and specifically 12 of them. Or time could be kept with a water clock, which during the late Bronze Age, the Egyptians were the ones who had the water clock, and this was probably the best technology for tracking the time during that age. And there was also candles that you could use, like lighting incense or beeswax, and oil lamps. So with the night and day, you have two different realms, but together it's the same, right? It's just time. And fire proves vital in lighting the night, allowing for further industrious and academic pursuits, right? And it unlocks nearly half the year that was once in the dark. That's probably where we get the number 7 and 70 related to the sentinels in Book 9 of the Iliad, where there are 7 sentinels or days and 100 youths with each. So you can interpret the number 700 as the number of 12-hour halves in a year, roughly. There's roughly 350 days in a year, and if you times that by 2, you're at 700. And 100 is probably the 3-month period or seasons. And once again, then 7 is the number of days. So likewise, in Exodus, it starts off with the 70 elders who came to Egypt with Jacob at the end of Genesis, and the 70 elders who were consecrated by priest, by Moses and Aaron, and then there's 100 youths. To me, Book 9 and 10 of the Iliad are about what we call manufacturing the consent, and that you can't spell consent without sentinels, and the sentinels represent language or structured words or meanings forged into sentences, but also backed by the law with, again, sentences, right, or justice. And I would argue that this is where we get the word censorship, but also it's synonymous with scholarship, or it's at least related, as I hope to show. From this conscious creation of language, the realm of time has nearly doubled, right? The spatial aspect of progress that goes hand in hand with religion, both in the Hebrew Bible, but also the Greek world of Homer's Iliad. And in Book 9 and 10, the goddess Athena is a prominent figure, which makes sense in that we understand her to be the goddess of education, social justice, law, and strategy. I would go further than that and say that she's also the goddess of the sea, fishermen, birds, fish, naval acumen, in addition to the goddess of language, which would make sense that she is the goddess who interfaces with the public in regards to all these kind of facets of society, like language, law, and justice, and military strategy. And it's with this sense of hope and confidence I can prove in this video. She represents that. Like today, there are liberals are portrayed as the SJWs, right? They create these new nonsensical words, or they get them from academia, and then they go out and patrol the language as well as censor counter narratives. And we can understand them as essentially intelligence proxies, right? If not members of the intelligence community at large. At the intersection of all this is where they interact with the cult of Hephaestus, right? This technology and capital that goes into the manufacture of the material goods that makes this civilization as we know it possible. The civilizational cult of Hephaestus, right, is involved in the formation of language, time, and other pillars of our society like the law, education, religion, science, and technology. And of course, Hermes is there too, but he kind of goes unnoticed unless you're really sharp and you can understand the symbolism. Language has been used in a conscious and sophisticated manner to dictate and direct the populace in service of the ruling elite for at least the past 4,000 years. And most today can outline the mechanism of this so-called manufactured consent without daring to be more specific, right, and get to the root of the foundations of this process of creating the mainstream popular discourse. Even more so, most would be able to give a vague description of the system and how it works while simultaneously falling victim to it, right? They're never going to leave the dialectic, and they're going to go further feeding the flames in the process, right? Because no Republican or Democrat is coming to save you, or us for that matter. Sure, they'll say some base things to draw out the vote, but in reality, they are puppets themselves, right? And some are better actors than others. Some are awkward and creepy, sweaty weirdos who will say whatever it takes. Some are dumb and attract attention for that, while others are kind of the perfect balance of all these and can represent the popular opinion of one side of the debate, right? This losing side. And you say, why would anyone willingly fight for the losing side or knowingly participate in this theater? Why haven't the populace stopped believing in democracy or just having this stupid dialectic around everything in the first place? Why can't we just come to a single mind? And it's a good question with an even harder solution, right? That's the dilemma of our time or any time. Technology makes it easier to spread a message, and that's kind of a double-edged sword, right? And like a lot of matters, it splits into two ways: a dichotomy or a dialogue. Language can bring us together, but it also divides us. But not everything is really that simple. But two is really the lowest common denominator, right? Besides the obvious one, but one you're not dividing. It's just a universe or a monopole. So it makes sense that democracy will descend into this bipolar race to the bottom. So you create a new ethno-lingual branch. You divide by two, and you have left, right, plus, minus, pro and contra, for, against. You see how the logic comes from it, and basically it's one and the same, right? Mathematics and logic. And the Greeks were known for their logic and mathematics, and this extended all the way up to their architecture. All the individual components and building blocks have their own measure and meaning behind their construction. And likewise, with poetry and Homeric tradition, we see the same detail and logic pervading in the Iliad, and most specifically with the naming conventions. I'd imagine the names give flexibility and blank space to fill in with details and meaning, right? So I argue that portions of the Iliad are already kind of set in stone, right? The formula already exists. It's proven itself over time, over thousands of years, to get the results you want. So the only things that change are just these key parameters: names, places, objects, things, or nature in general. And even a lot of these parameters are halfway there, where the characteristics are known, but just the naming convention is lacking. Like there are certain portions of the Iliad you can just date to the Neolithic or early Bronze Age by comparing with Sumerian poems, right? The language symbology is so similar that it has to be the same, which I think means that it's some kind of hymn or prayer, or in general, this incorruptible or solid block that is in the text of the poem, right? That makes the entire poem coherent, and you, the author, have to work around it. It probably makes your life easier, too, when writing something so large in scope, like an epic poem, but most importantly, it's for your own good. Certain gods have to be prayed to, right? They have to be prayed, and you have to get everything right about them. Before becoming a priest or a higher member of a religious cult, one would have to spend years being a scribe, practicing reading, writing, transcribing poems such as The Bird and Fish, an ancient Sumerian poem that I find has many similarities to Book 9 and 10 of the Iliad, especially relating to Athena, the Greek goddess, and Nanche, the Sumerian goddess of the seas, fishermen, social justice, fish, and birds. Knowing this, I recognize Athena is going to necessitate all these hymns or attributes we associate with the goddess of wisdom within books 9 and 10, right? It's a block in there. It's set in stone, right? You know it's going to come. But there's plenty of wiggle room and space to create a narrative for whatever purpose you may have when directing or leading people. So again, you ask, why don't people rise up? And it seems odd that the argument is never organic. It's always preconceived. But when talking about systems that are as sophisticated as like the U.S. economy or any market or asset really that is worth a certain value, a value that exceeds more than the single individual or a handful for that matter, we're talking about systems that of course are made up of the individual, but they're a cog, right? It's much bigger than any one person. It may be directed ultimately by a person or an executive, but the process of controlling or managing the system is it's concerted effort on a hierarchy of subsystems or major and minor characters in a play. So in Book 9 and 10 of the Iliad, I interpret Homer sets up the framework for how public discourse or a dialectic is manufactured in a large, sophisticated system like a centralized government. So by the naming convention and how they appear in the poem, we the reader can get a sense of the chain of command. But the words and names have meanings themselves, right? And they provide the logic and direction for the subsystems to properly function, how they interact with one another. The discourse or object of argument for whatever particular day or matter is decided, right? And it's constructed in a premeditated fashion. It's literally a work of fiction. It's manufactured down to the words and the letters themselves. Homer's Iliad is 24 books long, and if we look at it through the lens of the traditional 3-act play, that means 8 books is like 1 unit or 1/3 of the book. And books 9 and 10 are somewhat similar to books 1 and 2, but they, like the story, have progressed and have gotten deeper into the narratives, into the system or network of characters, places, and things that make up the poem. So by book 9 and 10, you know more than in book 1 and 2. But in general, the dynamic is the same, right? Agamemnon is worried and he's paranoid about his legitimacy as king of the Greeks, the leader and unifying figure of these various Greek tribes and kingdoms. The crowd is always fickle. Morale of the troops is always the top priority. The crowd needs to be directed. And the first 2 acts of the Iliad, it's clear that Agamemnon's position and his authority is not always absolute, and he functions mainly as a plutocrat. And you fast forward to book 9, and he's sending Odysseus and others to basically try and bribe Achilles back into the fight. So we can think of Achilles as this liberal side of the conservative Old Testament politics of the Bronze Age, and Hector would be the conservative end of that spectrum. But without Achilles, half the argument is missing, and Agamemnon is worried in book 9 and 10, like in books 1 and 2 of the Iliad, right? It's the same thing. But we get a better look and a more in-depth look into just how the narrative is created and argument develops. And it's the absence of Achilles that makes it possible, right? It's born out of the desperation of Agamemnon. He reorganizes his defenses with the formation of the Sentinels, and he sends Odysseus and Diomedes on the offensive during a secret midnight mission in order to, 1, gather better intel on the Trojans, and 2, to plunder and steal. In a sense, these groups of people make up Achilles in sum, right? And that Achilles will provide both offense and the defense needed, because the Greeks, without Achilles, they're defenseless in a sense, because Hector knows he can do whatever on the battlefield. So if you take each of these new roles or positions that Agamemnon creates, you sum them up, each character and their role, you have the attempt at a replacement of Achilles. But ultimately it fails. The first time Moses comes down with the 10 Commandments, he's ignored by the Israelites. And likewise, Agamemnon's attempt to reshuffle the deck after Achilles rejects his bribe is a failure. It's not until the 3rd act, or book 18, that Achilles comes back. So in the beginning of book 9, Agamemnon is crying and his tears are compared to a waterfall or a stream falling off a cliff, which I imagine as the water clock, which was a way of telling time by relating the volume of water retained in a vessel to the duration of time by holding the flow rate into the vessel constant, right? So, and the water clock was originally an Egyptian technology that spread to the Levant, Persia, Greece, and the Hellenic world, etc. And Homer describes the Greeks as scattered in a dark sea. They were without a language or edge in technology that will organize them and allow them to survive the dark, stormy sea, right? Which serves as this allegory for the nighttime. And the water clock helps you track the time of the night, right? It gives you a precise and accurate way of tracking the night, and therefore you get a better sense of time, right? You start understanding how the world itself is physically defined, and combine that with, I also think it's also a metaphor for petroleum, or this oily rock, right? Or kerosene, or better yet, naphtha, right? That we connect to the tribe of Naphtali. And it's this naturally occurring oil substance that could be burned for light, right? This lamp or menorah that the Hebrews are famous for. And it's kept as this eternal flame for an easy access to fire that's going to help you become more industrious, right? It unlocks half the world, essentially, right? This hemisphere of time, or the other side of the world that is in the dark. In Book 9 of the Iliad, before bribing Achilles, Agamemnon, the leader of the Greeks, calls his top princes and counselors to first explain how worried he is over the state of the campaign, right, and discuss the possibility of leaving to sail back to Greece. And he didn't wish, but he doesn't wish to cry out loud, right? He only wants to tell his top princes first. He wishes to guard the information, and the people are gathered man by man. But only the top people are gathered into his tent first. And in the tent, the heroic Greek soldier Diomedes upbraids Agamemnon for wanting to sail back home. Right? He's basically calling him a coward, and it's poetic justice, because in Book 4, it's Agamemnon who calls out Diomedes for not being in the fight. It's a good rhetorical technique, right? If you know sports, it's like the hard-nosed coach who's a winner. He runs a tight ship, and you'll probably end up hating them in the end because they'll never give you the validation. But ultimately, they're not there to praise you, but to motivate you and direct you to best fulfill your position, right? And if everyone does their job and fulfills their position, the team is better off, right? You're kind of this monolith or a rock. It's like in Exodus 17, when Moses gets water out of the stone. It's like a football coach, right? He needs to just get inches in some instances to win the game. And you have to get it out of the rock, this team, right? And I interpret Exodus 17 as like Book 4 of the Iliad, and that Book 4 is kind of like halfway of the first act, right? You're halfway through the season, or maybe like a third way through the season. And the team is kind of like 500, right? It's 50-50, equal wins and losses. But you still have hopes of winning the championship, and maybe it's halftime, you're down, and you're the coach, right? And you're kind of a dick. You're a hard-nosed coach, but you're also a winner. So you got to assemble all these disparate people and subsystems to function as one. And metaphorically, you need to get water out of the stone. And it's Agamemnon in Book 4 who's like Moses when he goes around the locker room and he's trying to fire up his fighters, right? And he goes after Diomedes and he's calling him a coward. And that's why Diomedes comes after him in Book 9, right? Fast forward to Book 9, it's Diomedes. Like, once again, he gets this poetic justice. And it's like the locker room speaking up to the coach. They've had enough, right? The coach is riding him maybe a little too much, and they're just airing out some frustrations at the leadership. But it comes ultimately from a good place, right? It's all about winning. And sure, some personal glory, but ultimately, if everyone fulfills their role, and there's some give and take, the chain of command works, right? And you win. And locker room blow-ups happen, but you have to keep it in-house and spin it in the press. And that's what Nestor's for. And it's kind of interesting. Sports is still kind of one of the last realms you can apply a morality of us versus them, especially with the press. Diomed is important in that he represents the two halves of Agamemnon's rule. either side of the caduceus. He's the people and whole. He's the popular support, the locker room. His name is Diomedes, which some suggest counsel of Zeus or godlike cunning. But you have to realize he's Diomed, right? You could argue it's di or two, and med, which is median or middle. And median is the most common opinion or value. It's not the mean or average of the fringes. Diomed works in tandem with Nestor, who represents the legitimizing medium between Agamemnon, the central power, right, and those he rules over, the confederation of Greek tribes. Nestor is the PR machine, the state-run media. Nestor's naming convention means homecomer. He's the returner, or one who travels. Furthermore, there's theories that his name means like he who brings the war folk back and he who leads the war folk out. In addition, like almost all major characters in the Iliad, in patronymic fashion, right? Son of Neleus is literally has the same meaning as Nestor. Likewise, Nestor is the son of Neleus, but it's questionable whether Neleus is an independent person outside of just a naming convention for Nestor, right? And part of this kind of rhyming scheme or poetic device. So here, I'll read here from, it's called A Concise Inventory of Greek Etymologies, or CIGE, and it's from the Hellenic Studies at Harvard University, where the project's goal is to provide access to etymologies that are important for the study of Greek culture that are often not yet referenced in the conventional dictionaries. CIGE represents an understanding of Greek, and especially Homeric etymology, as part of the formulaic system of early Greek poetry. Poetic function can be of crucial etymological importance, and conversely, etymology can be essential for understanding poetry, especially when it comes to the Homeric lexicon. This is not because the synchronic meaning of a given word is determined by its etymology, but because traditional cultural systems such as Homeric poetry evolve over time, right, and have to be approached not only synchronically but also diachronically. And I agree, right? And I think things like this are helpful tools to take advantage of others' work that has gone into like putting together, right, these supplemental resources to allow others like me to kind of glom on, right, to make whole of these disparate pieces. So reading further in particular, the entry relating to Nestor on this CIGE site, the linear B evidence led quickly to the realization that Nestor, the son, had a name that repeated in the part of the name of Neleus, the father. When the latter is understood as original, Nesilaos, the father, was he who brings the warfolk back, and the son was simply he who brings back. So Nestor is like CNN or Fox News, the war machine, the Pentagon too as well. They always are trying to bring the troops home or send them out. But in reality, the oscillations back and forth keep the troops out, right? And I've made this connection of Nestor to the Roman being Janus, and it makes sense. The gates of Janus send the soldiers out, but they bring them back, right? And I think this will make more sense when we look at the analogous figure of Aaron and his sons in the book of Exodus in particular. So Aaron in Hebrew means bright, accumulation, center of cheer, where it comes from the verb or, to become light, har, which is mountain or hill, and aron, to be agile, aroused, or at the center of cheer. And so I think if you understand Nestor from the Iliad, you would agree with this definition, where accumulation is just like a wise tribal elder, and the center of cheer is like this medium or the mainstream media for Agamemnon, right, the centralized power. But also, like Nestor, he's mentioned in terms of being an being part of this like elder priest-like class, right? He's of the tribe Levite, this tribal leader of the Levantines, and so Levite might be a reference to the Levant. And maybe we can understand Nestor as this Levantine priest import, or just this Levantine influence on religion. We could also speculate that Aaron literally means Haran, this ancient city in northwest Mesopotamia, mentioned in the book of Genesis, or that the Levites who descend from Aaron are originally from the city of Haran. Looking at Aaron further, two of his sons are mentioned by name, Abihu and Nadab, which is interesting when paired with the understanding of Nestor and Neleus. So Abihu means he is father, whose father is he, which on itself is a weird kind of sentence in that it doesn't mean anything really. But if you look at it from, in the case of Nestor and Neleus, it's just kind of this patronymic device, right? It's like the character Nestor. He's both the son of Neleus and then he's Nestor himself. Moreover, we can think of Diomed as the locker room, and he's like the locker room chat or blow up. And if there's a locker room chat or blow up, it stays in there, and it's Nestor who handles or legitimizes this return home to center, right? He's the medium that brings people home and sends them out. He's the nostalgia. Furthermore, we can link Nestor with Aaron, and that Aaron means to become light. Where in Book 9 of the Iliad, the Greeks at the advice of Nestor light the torches for the watchpost, right? And also that Nestor is like this homecomer, right? He brings people home, and that Book 9 he advises everyone to have a supper, right? He raises everyone's morale, and everyone's all cozy and comfort with the sentinels and the torches lit. Nestor is there for the PR purposes. And most importantly, Nestor makes Agamemnon realize he needs to delegate his power, so they create these 7 sentinels, the light or torchbearers who protect and watch camp, an allegory for how the narrative really never sleeps, right? And the fire's always burning, and the furnace of Hephaestus is always lit for crafting. Additionally, they serve as an allegory for the threshold or frontier of bringing justice, language, education, technology, they're a symbolic portal or demarcation to another time, right? Similar to the understanding of Janus as a portal being or liminal figure. One thing I noticed with Nestor is he's always the first to address the troops at large, especially in Book 2 or in Book 9, right? These situations where the crowd is starting to turn on Agamemnon, where even Agamemnon is worried and has to make some amends, right? He succeeds power to Nestor, this priestly class, this Levite or Levantine priest, I interpret. Relating to Exodus, we have to keep in mind the texts don't match up perfectly, but we can do an analysis of the books from the Iliad and chapters from Exodus. Just the stories are the same, it's just some minor differences as far as plot details, but again, overall they are both the same myth. So in Exodus, after the Israelites subvert and plunder the Egyptians, they flee into the desert, and they have their Passover. And then the Egyptians, led by Pharaoh, are killed when they followed the Israelites into the Red Seas, and the wall of water ends up closing in on them, and they flee. That's where we find Agamemnon in the Greeks in Book 7 of the Iliad, right? Where Agamemnon or Moses has had this kind of Aristeia moment. But also, things aren't well for the Greeks, right, at the same time. Because in Book 8, they're backed up by the Trojans to their ships on the beach, and they have to build this wall to separate them from the Trojans, who are led by Jupiter, the cloud gatherer. And at night, the Trojans burn fires that light up the plains in front of the Greek camps. And it's just like that in Exodus, that Moses and the Israelites are led by a pillar of clouds, and the tent is obscured by this pillar of clouds too. And then at night, the fire burns and it leads the way, right? And Jove is ultimately on Agamemnon's side, like the Lord is on Moses' side. But it's just that they have to suffer, right? So we can interpret it that the Greeks first must suffer before ultimately they can sack Troy. And this suffering, the pillar of cloud during the day, is like this bloody losses to the Trojans, paired with the paranoia and fear of the consuming fire, right, that lights the night sky. It's what lies before you tomorrow. And those who wish to win or succeed must suffer, right? And it's kind of that in-between, that liminal time, right? And that you got to have the belief to carry on, right, of this ultimate triumph. And it's like a religious-like pursuit. It's a discipline. Eventually, the Israelites make it to Mount Sinai, where Moses goes up and gets the commandments from God for the first time, and then comes down to the tent of meeting, resembling Book 8, where Jupiter in the beginning lays down the law and tells all the others gathered, the Olympian gods, that he is the foremost and powerful among them. But ultimately it doesn't last or take, and the rest of the minor gods and goddesses interfere, and the Trojans and Greeks go back to fighting eventually, and the gods of Olympus too are once again divided until the end of the Iliad. And the fighting's back and forth, which is how I interpret the fight in Exodus with the Amalekites, right? In Exodus 17 again. Not that this kind of fight, the Amalekites versus the Israelites, takes place in just one space of time or book of the Iliad. I think it's just in general the back and forth nature, right? That the Amalekites are like the Trojans or one of the confederated tribes who stand in the way of Agamemnon from sacking Troy. Like the Israelites want to sack Jericho, but they have these Amalekites in the way, right? Just kind of other troops or other tribe. And Agamemnon, like Moses, relies on two people to endure the back and forth, the locker room and the media press, if we're using the analogy of a manager or sports coach, because Agamemnon uses both Diomed, the locker room, and Nestor, the media, whereas Moses, in an analogous fashion, has Her, the locker room, and Aaron, the PR machine, to hold up his two arms, one opposite the other, and together they are able to overcome the Amalekites in triumph. These three parts coming together to form a monolith, a well-functioning machine, a closed system that gives and takes, but one that ultimately succeeds or performs effectively, contains within it, these kind of three parts or disparate entities. You have the neurotic Agamemnon, paranoid, ever thinking, but also fallible and steadfast. He gives and takes. He is like Moses. And then you have Nestor, the elder and well-spoken figure who acts like the press, or at least a favorable press like a PR department or state-run media. And then you have Diomed, who's like Her, the locker room. Reading further into Book 9 of the Iliad, you have the formation of the 7 sentinels. So let's read from the Iliad. Book 9. Thus did he speak, and they did even as he had said. The sentinels went out in their armor, under command of Nestor's son Thrasymedes, a captain of the host, and of the bold warriors Ascalaphus and Iolmenus. There was also Meriones, Aphareus, and Deipyrus, and the son of Creon, noble Lycomedes. The 7 sentinels are important in that their names have meanings, which allow further interpretation and guidance. We can relate this to Exodus 24 and the confirmations of the covenant, where the 7 sentinels are the 70 elders along with Moses, Aaron, and his 2 sons, Nadab and Abihu, where I've already talked about Abihu, functions as this patronymic device like that of son of Neleus when referring to Nestor. Aaron, though, has another son, Nadab, whose name in Hebrew is willing, volunteer, generous, from the verb to willingly give, which I equate with the first sentinel named Thrasymedes, the son of Nestor. His name means bold of thought. And being the son of Nestor, he's of the priestly class, right? He's like this Levite, if you want to make the analogy to Exodus, right? He's the Levite Aaron. And Thrasymedes is the based one, though, right? He's the son. He's the one who's allowed to have the bold thought. He provides the bold thought because he's of Nestor, right? He's like the son of CNN. He's more based or woke than CNN, right? So he's one of these journalist outlets. I don't even know which names. They're like shit-lib ones. Thrasymedes resembles Nadab in that he willingly gives or donates his sword to Diomedes in Book 10 of the Iliad. I'm not sure if Nadab relates to a people, but it could be the Nawar or these gypsy-like people in the Middle East, which I think makes sense when you understand fully the connection with Thrasymedes, because the name Thrasymedes has more meaning, but I'll wait until later in the video where I discuss Book 10 in more depth. So, staying in Book 9, the second sentinel is named Ascalaphus, whose name can be translated to owl, or means owl, which we associate with Athena, right? And if you break it down even further, you can say it's Didascalus, or Didascalus, right? Which translates to roughly I teach, where Ascalos is a teacher, or better yet, a scholar, the wise person who's probably, and here's probably where we associate owls or birds in general with being smarter, at least educated, and associated with Athena, who plays an important part in Books 9 and 10 of the Iliad. It's her guidance and strategy that allows Diomed and Odysseus to complete their covert mission. And Ascalaphus is the son of Mars or Ares. So this is probably where we get the war strategy of Athena, right? And it's generated through scholarship, and it's represented by the owl, Ascalaphus. Furthermore, we can link Athena with the Sumerian goddess Nanshe, who is the goddess of social justice, courts, law, but also of the seas and fishing, and birds too, especially the pelican, the bird of fishermen, which is going to become more apparent if you read or when I discuss Book 10. Specifically, there is a Sumerian poem for training scribes called Bird vs. Fish that essentially lays out the manufacturing of consent that we see in the Iliad by establishing this new court that is necessary to handle civilian matters. Imagine it's like day 5 in Genesis 1 of the Bible. You're at the point of creation of your state or world that you need to secede or divide power and responsibilities to lesser gods or to courts within control of the palace. The next sentinel is Iomenes, which etymologically means to send forward, where menos or menin is to remain, and ial or ial is a negating prefix. So combining the two, you get this to not remain, or how it's translated how it's translated in Greek, send forward, right? He's the forward acting sentinel, this censorious individual who probably has a good sense and who takes the knowledge and sends it forward. Or maybe we can think of him as like a port city, right? He's this trading outpost where the Menos could originate from Orchomenos, where Orchomenos is a location in Greece. But Orchomenos in general is like a lot of different places or people in like Greek literature that was mentioned, where Orchomenos is said to be one of the sons of Thyestes by a Naiad whose flesh was served to their own father by Atreus, whose brothers were Aglaus and Caelus. And Atreus is important because he's the father of Agamemnon, right? Agamemnon is the son of Atreus. And there's a whole backstory right to that, and I won't get into that. But my point is that Aglaus and Caelus are like similar words to both Caelus and Gaelic and also Aegean and even Egyptian. So if you go into the lexicon and you search for definitions, you'll use the root words to search, and the root you'll find is IAL, right? It's common, returning a hit for the word Aigyptio, which means sea coast, and I imagine again this trading outpost where nothing remains but is sent forward. And you might say, well, how do you equate or come up with that with just from the 3 letters IAL? Well, I essentially think that this Aigyptio is like, it means the house of the Aegean Sea, right? Basically the sea coast, as the Greeks called it. Or better yet, it's like the abode of the sea nymph or naiad Aegina, the sea coast. So basically IAL is like the royal abode. And today we know it in the form still, right? YAL is royal, or GAL is regal. Think of, I've already said this in a video, Portugal, but you could even say Port of Calais and Cornwall all essentially mean the same, right? Where in Greek, or, and then a cognate of it, ORT, it means mound or mountain, and you modify that with P and you have port, or the city by the sea, and then the Gaul ending means like regal, or in a sense it means Gaelic, and then the wall in Cornwall is again royal or regal, a suffix meaning, as we all know today, Gaelic or Welsh, right? Wall is kind of like this Wales, and then Wallish is probably like Welsh, this patronymic naming. And then taking it further, you have Aigyptio or Egyptian. And Egyptian could literally be that it was named or thought of as kind of this trade outpost to the Phoenicians or Levantines, where Egypt is derived from the late Egyptian period of the Amarna period. So I'm just reading for the Wikipedia here. It's Ptah, or literally Memphis, a corruption of the early Egyptian name, home of the Ka or soul of Ptah. So the name of a temple to the god Ptah at Memphis. And Ptah, or I hope I'm saying this right. Like this guy's name could literally be like snake hissing and stuff. But anyways, we can understand him as analogous to Hephaestus, right? Where Ptah is the Egyptian god of craftsmanship, architecture, metalworking, etc. Furthermore, the name Memphis gives some insight too, in that with the word Ptah, the PH is there. It's just kind of separated in the middle, right by that tau, that TA. So how do you get Memphis with the PHIS, right? Like, how do you get that sound? And with Greek, we have the Greek. It seems like we get the Greek phi from this Ptah. First, I find it helpful relating to the modern day, right? A good example would be to contrast the pair of Italy and Spain, where the two countries have both Greek and Latin influences, but I think Spain carries more phonetic or Phoenician characteristics in there, and then in that it's probably more closer to the Hebrew or the Semitic language, and their language is probably, and it's probably due to the Carthaginians, right, who conquered Spain before losing to Rome. But Spain carries more phonetic or, I argue, Phoenician characteristics in their language, right? I mean, most people today think of Spain as kind of like this, well, it's like a vulgar Latin, but it's even more so. It's like an easier form of kind of Italian or Latin, that it's very phonetic, right? It's kind of easy to understand. It's very formal, too, as well. There's not really many exceptions to the rules. And this is probably due to the Carthaginians or the Punics or the Phoenicians, right? So, unlike the Italians and others who use the Latin type, or they use they're more strict with this, the Spanish retain the phi, but they incorporate it into the F or the FA, right? It's geography, but it's geographia with the F and not geography. And like in English that we use this Latinized PH, right? You borrow the PH. And the F is a unique letter, right? It's FA in Spanish, but the phi is still in there. It's a unique vocalization of the FA, the F, right? But ask a Spanish speaking like a Guatemalan to say fish, and they're gonna say fish. Ask a Spanish speaking person to say Memphis, they'll probably say Memphis instead of the fis, right? In similar fashion, imagine that's how we go from like Pisces or Pesces or whatever in Italian to fish in English, right? Some kind of something's lost in translation. And so why go through all this besides kind of just like blowing smoke up your butt? Because it gives some insights, right? The words have meaning, sentences have logic and direction, and the sum total is the myth, right? It's comprehensive and it's coherent because of the details. And Iomanus could just mean send forth, or maybe if you go a little further, port city. But in reality, there's a lot to the character and name, right? But also, to know this is like intelligence, right? For traders, infiltrators, foreign priests or shamans and pirates, right? To kind of like understand the language, you kind of gotta embed yourself within the culture, but at the same time, the symbols are embedded within the myth, right? They're like in parallel. So if you know all these languages and intricacies within the cultures and what to call people and like what to say and all that, or how to interact, right? How we know today is just culture, but in a sense, it's kind of like common knowledge today, right? With all the mandatory public schools, we kind of already, like most people take Spanish, right, or something, or people already understand how to interact in a multicultural world or global world. But in the ancient days, not everyone had access to education, or they had this path to literacy that everyone has today. So knowing the alphabet in these mythic or childlike literary forms was helpful for a less enlightened time. Poetry has always been this form of kind of a mnemonic device. Moving further, Meriones can be deciphered from the Latinized form or the Greek. So the Greeks have eta, and then they have epsilon, where Eta is like an H or an E, and epsilon is the more familiar English E. So Meriones can come from MER, mer, or meros, which means part or unit, where mer is like a unit, or like in chemistry, it's like a molecule that is repeated in a polymer or plastic, right? There's multiple mers or units or blocks that make up the polymer material in large. But like if you take it as an eta, it's MHRIONES, and that's how the Greeks have it. They have it as an eta. So you have this vulgar term for vagina, where MHR or mer means thigh or hip, and so I think like the Meriones is like this the dividing line or unit, like it separates the units, right? So once again, it's like this midway point or meridian, maybe, if you will. It's like the slit of, of the vagina, I guess. I interpret. So from mer or meros, we can derive a meridian, where a meridian is a dividing line, more specifically these longitudinal lines, right, north to south, where dividing is a prevalent theme throughout books 9 and 10, and likewise in Exodus, where, in the first attempt they're dividing up all the kind of dimensions of the tabernacle and such. And the meridian is the halfway slice going north-south again. And books 9 and 10 take place at night, and it could be that the night became more productive with fire and light, and eventually you kind of calculate down to the hours in a month and a day, a year, etc., right? Like you've kind of hit down to like the hour, right? And I think that's kind of what Meriones represented. It's like these unit, the smallest unit that you can divide. It's like the hour of a day. And along with the parts, of course, where the tabernacle is mentioned and designed before being cut and built. So the laws are divided into 10 parts. The ornamentations are designed, the blueprint of this new religion that is being created, right? The measuring in comes before the cutting, and this is like a metaphor for the delegation of responsibility and power, right? With Meriones, he represents this lower station of management. The fifth sentinel is Aphareus, which in Greek means the belly fin of the tuna. And so, again, this is kind of interesting. And when you think about it in terms of Athena, and again, with respect to the Sumerian god Nanchi, this fish god, right, this goddess of the sea, fish, and fishermen. But she was also the goddess of justice and charity. So basically, you see this is probably where Athena comes from, or education is really the ability, or language is really the ability to guide or sail in the dark, right? It's the rudder of the boat is doing the steering, right? But it's not visible on the surface. It's like the belly fin of the tuna. Because if you look further into the name Aphareus, first you have this Apha, right? It's kind of like an F, but it's it's not quite. It's somewhat like the Spanish FA, but I'm not gonna go into detail there. But it means to hide or be invisible. So Apha, invisible, and then the suffix reus means priest or high chieftain. So it's kind of means what it says. It's this cryptic figure within the religion, right? This priest, and I'd imagine he's kind of has this relatively high position with that organization, and that's kind of why he needs to hide behind the curtains, maybe. But he's still doing the steering, right? He's the rudder. But it could just mean priests in general, in the sense that they're these kind of invisible or cryptic guiders, right? They're these rudders that give direction in these esoteric symbolic terms, right, within the mythology, or like a sermon or something. And language, you could say, is like that, or a map, or any type of education that allows one to steer in the dark. Where everyone else is in the dark, you are kind of more enlightened, right? I think that's kind of where that terminology comes from. And education and religion were synonymous. and you might be able to say the same today, although people might not like it, right? But basically, Homer is like laying out both spectrums, right? He lays out the liberalism as well as the conservatism, right? Going further, Aphareus we can relate to Athena, to this Aphe. So Aphea was a Greek goddess who was worshipped almost exclusively at a single sanctuary on the island of Aegina in the Saronic Gulf. She originated as early as the 14th century BCE as a local deity associated with fertility in the agricultural cycle. Under the later Athenian hegemony, she became to be identified with the goddess Athena and Artemis, and with the nymph Britomardis as well by the 2nd century CE, the time of Pausanias. On Aegina, as one goes toward the mountain of Zeus, god of Hellenes, the sanctuary of Phaea, comes up, for whom Pindar composed an ode at the behest of the Aeginetes. The Cretans say, the myths are about her, a native to Crete, that Eubolus was the son of Carmenor, who purified Apollo of the killing of the Python. And they say that Britomardis was the daughter of Zeus, and Carme, the daughter of this Eubolus. She enjoyed races and hunts, and was particularly dear to Artemis. While fleeing from Minos, who lusted after her, she cast herself into nets cast for a catch of fish. Artemis made her a goddess, not only the Cretans, but also the Aeginetans revere her. The Aeginetans say that Britomardis showed herself to them on their island. Her epithet among the Aeginetans is Aphaea, and it is Dictynia of the nets on Crete. So, well, I can't kind of butchered some of those pronunciations. Again, she's related to this Aphaea god, who is in turn related to nets, but also fishing. So we can again relate it back to the Sumerian god Nanchi. The 6th sentinel is Deipyrus, or basically day plus Pyrus, where day means truly or indeed, and Pyrus of course means fire or flame. So I can imagine this is like Saturday, or the 6th day of the Gentile week, right? And the 7th day of the Jewish week, the Sabbath, this day where the flame is worshipped and it rests, right? You can't even light the flame on the Jewish Sabbath or Saturday. Finally, the 7th sentinel is Lycomedes. So Lycomedes is you can probably understand him as the counselor of Lycia or Lycia, or Lyco or Lycia is like associated with the wolf, or he's also associated with Apollo. So this Mede, yes, it is counselor, so we can understand him as probably like this counselor of Lycian Apollo, or the Lycian sun, right? So effectively, it's probably like Sunday, right? We can understand Lycomedes is like this Sunday. It's this day off. If you're not, right, probably celebrating the Saturday or the Sabbath on the 6th day, you celebrate on the 7th day, right? If you're a Gentile, on Sunday, right? And the 6th day is the flame, and the flame is Hephaestus. Where I argue we can link his name to the Hebrew Bible. So in the Bible, in Exodus, there's a character named Hur, where analyzing the name Hur, it means noble man, cavern. So maybe it's like a noble caveman, and it comes from the root harar, to be a central hub of heat, or this is how I interpret Diomedes, right? He's the locker room. He's the central hub of heat, perhaps, or he's like the cave, right? He's like this cave, the locker room. But perhaps we can think of Diomedes in terms of her as like this urn or a furnace. He's the furnace of Hephaestus or Vulcan. Because I interpret the Greeks are making a sword overnight in Book 9, right? And they're going to use it in Book 10 as this like new edge of a weapon. And Diomedes specifically is going to use it in his, Diomedes is going to use it in the secret spy mission. And I think this is because Hur has a son, Uri, whose name means Yah's light, fury, my flame. Basically, he's kind of like the flame in the furnace, right? So the flame is the son of the furnace. It's like this patronymic device, this rhyming, right? You don't think there's like poetry in the Bible, but it's there, right? This Uri, son of Hur. So the rhyming or poetic verse is basically Uri, son of Hur, has the flame in the furnace. So they're making the steel for the sword, right, in this furnace or this urn. And Uri has a son himself who is the personification of like Hephaestus, and that Uri's son Bezalel is the one who physically makes the tabernacle and the lamp, and he's like the worker aspect of Hephaestus, right? He's the personification, right? Because like in the Jewish myth, it's like in a sense, they're like composites, right? Because like you don't mention these gods, but there's these pieces and particles. Also, this naming convention to say Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hor, is like it's like a rhyming scheme. It's poetry, and we can understand it's similar to like Diomedes, who is son of Tydeus, right? But in Greece, in Greek, it's Diomedes, son of Tydides, right? Again, it's this rhyming scheme. It's also how we can get like different interpretations in books from the Iliad. Like within the Iliad, you can say there's books of Exodus, Numbers, and even like books of Samuel, which you would argue happened generations later, or like happened much in a greater amount of time later that you wouldn't associate being incorporated in the Iliad. But it's because of these patronymic naming devices. I argue, right? It's like this Diomedes, son of Tydides. There's like multiple generations within a couple words. So like within the formulaic nature and symmetry and dichotomy of these myths, yeah, you could have more than one myth or mythos within these books, which by just kind of the naming, right? And once again, I think the Spanish and the Italian give some insight just comparing the two, and that furnace or urn is horno or Horno in Spanish, and I reckon it's like her, right? Whose name means cave or again center or hub of a fire. So her is like horno in Spanish or urn, this vessel that can be heated to high enough temps to melt iron. And Uri is the son of Hor, where Uri means like fury and flame and light. And Spanish flame is fuego, and then fury is what? Ardiente. Whereas in the Latinized Italian, furnace is forno, right? It's not horno, it's the H, the Italian, the F in Italian is a Greek eta, right? Or it's like the silent H that we know in Spanish. The Italian F is the Spanish H, and only in some instances. I'm not going to say it's like a rule, because it's not always the case, because fire in Spanish is fuego, and in Italian it's what? Fuoco, which is similar, and then fire in Italian or fury in Italian is like Spanish. It's ardente, right? It's like this uri almost, ardente. And probably where we get the phrase ardent passion or burning passion. Nevertheless, there are a lot of these kinds of instances of the Spanish H or Greek eta as being analogous to the Italian F. So relating this to Exodus, her again means the cave, where metaphorically the cave is the furnace itself, so the forno or horno. And furnaces are used to make steel and iron. And in Spanish, iron is hero or hero. And then in Italian, iron is fiero or ferrous from Latin. So the name Ferrari is the name Ferrari is like a Vulcan type name. It's like the iron worker who can shape this hunk of cold hard iron metal onto this magnificent machine, right? Because the iron is ferro, right? So it's like this iron worker. It's a craft. But like the name Hernando or Fernando or even Ferdinand is this patronymic name for steel workers. And on taking it further, like if we understand Egypt is kind of like this, it was known for this god Ptah, right? Or this Hephaestus character. Like the Phoenicians understood Memphis or this trading outpost as kind of being under the sway of this Hephaestus or this Ptah god, right? And likewise, when we think of Italy, we think of like Ferraris, right? It's kind of like the same thing. If people don't want to understand how kind of like culture or even these naming conventions and myths kind of happen, right? Or organically or not, right? It also means that the urgency, or Hernando also means like kind of this urgency of working overnight, right? Making steel is a long process, but other times, yeah, it's a lot of work, and like every minute counts, right? You got to be quick. You got to work quick, and it means working in earnest. And Ernie is probably like the English form where the Spanish H of like Hernan or hero is made into the English E, right? So, but like the ancients didn't have all these letters where Spanish, Italian, English have all 20-something odd letters, right, today. Ancient Greek was more limited, so not everything is phonetically perfect, right? And that's probably why some of the words are maybe longer. I don't know. Like fiery in English coming out of fire, and then furnace and fury. These are all kind of like modern translations of older, more limited vocabularies or symbolic sounds, right? Basically, that's why they all kind of sound alike. You have less keys on a piano versus today, I imagine. So essentially, this is how the ancients knew of Egypt again, right? So Memphis as literally the house of Ptah, where Ptah is the Egyptian smithy god. And my theory here is that the Phoenicians or Semites create what we know in English and in Spanish as the F or the FA, right? By turning the Ptah into the Greek phi plus this AE or FA, right? So Ptah in ancient Greek is spelled phi theta alpha. So phi theta alpha, but phonetically it should be pi tau, right? Pi tau or pi tau eta, but the eta is not really going to be pronounced. So it seems the pi the ptah was pronounced like the like the and an F or like a snake hissing, right? And then and if you don't believe me, like snake is ophis in Greek. So where ophis is a serpent, so this ophis, I can imagine looks like this snake hissing. The maybe the ptah, this English version, the ptah, Ptah, or we can assume that it's like the or sound of the snake hissing is involved, right? Because when you search the lexicon for this ptah, you use the Greek spelling, which is phi theta alpha. So they obviously understood it as this phi, and it brings back words with the root that could be interpreted as these epithets of the Egyptian god Ptah. So if you look on Wikipedia, there's a list of these epithets, and so if you search the phi theta alpha on the lexicon, you get this Phathano. It's I anticipate, proceed, arrive, to come or do first or before others, right? So this Ptah is the beginner, the begetter of the first beginning. Creating language, he's this crafter, but he also builds stuff the new, and he's a creation god. And next you'll hit on the lexicon, aphtharsia, which is indestructibility, incorruptibility, and immortality. So on Wikipedia, the epithet is Ptah, the Lord of eternity. And another interesting hit is this Jephthah, who appears in the Book of Judges as a judge, and then also he sacrifices his child. And Ptah is known as the master of justice, and that kind of brings me to my next point. And that what's really interesting is that from the root of Ptah, this phi theta alpha, if you add on the O or maybe this like OP from Ophis the snake, you get this opthal, like ophthalmologist, right? This eye doctor. And one hit you'll get is mon ophthalmos, which is an adjective for one-eyed. So it's like the Cyclops. And that's interesting because I've linked the Cyclops with one, the Sumerian Enki, but also the Greek Hephaestus, right? So maybe this Ptah is where we get this Cyclops, one-eyed. And I say from there I go, he's like Ptah, the master of ceremonies. Ptah, the god who made himself to be God, right? Because if you read Homer's Odyssey, the Cyclops like partakes in the Last Supper like scene with Odysseus, where Odysseus transforms to Joshua to like a Jesus-like figure, right? Stabs the Cyclops in his eye, and then he exits the cave like Jesus, and it's like a resurrection. And then Odysseus is kind of going to do something similar to that, like in Book 10. Right? And it's interesting that this kind of cements or confirms that link, that they're kind of like similar gods, right? Or this, we could just be thinking of the Cyclops, right? But then he would be this like fire or a craft god, like Ptah. Also, Ptah is the god who made himself to be God, right? And if you read Book 9 again of the Odyssey, the Cyclops is a ceremony figure, but they're as powerful as gods, and they think of themselves as so, right? That they're like They think of themselves as their own gods, right? They care about Jupiter or Zeus. And then another hit you'll get is ophthalmologia, which is service rendered only while the master watches. So if the master is like this one-eyed, is this the giant one-eyed fire thing that he watches you, and you're only get paid to do if you do the services while he watches. The service is rendered is the conclusion of a service agreement that is presented to the client to demand payment, right? So the payment is your wage. And so again, this is like where the name Ernie or Ernest or wage earner comes from. And even today, most transactions will see redemption through payment at the conclusion of the service. Right? You could see how the eye is like this inspector or sentinel to ensure the crafts are built to the exact specifications. And then you'll get your payment. And the eye is associated with truth and justice, also, right, the bear witness. And that's how we know Patha, these epithets, Lord of Truth, Master of Justice. And he means ophthalmos, right, this eye of a master or ruler, eye of heaven, that which is dearest or best in light, cheer, comfort. And so he's like this eye of the ruler of heaven that watches over you. Right? And it could just be that these are high people in this labor rackets, these cults of stonemasons or smithy guilds or stuff like that. Right? These laborers, and these are the middlemen who manage the labor, right? That go around and make sure that the work is getting done. And ophthalmeo is eye face, resist, to look against or straight at, and it's a metaphor to bear up against, withstand, bear witness, truth and justice, but also in terms of services rendered. So if you so get a return on the lexicon for Naphtali, which is interesting because Naphtali, right? He's the sixth son of Jacob, and he's the head of the Naphtali tribe. And of course, like all the sons of Jacob, they end up and are in Egypt. But what's interesting about him is Naphtali means cunning or crafty, and it's like how we know Hephaestus. In addition, it also means twisting and turning and torturous, which is like how iron, like working iron is, right? It's like a lot of twisting and turning, but it's also torturous in that it's like it's time consuming and it's hard work. If you use the phonetic version of this like English pathal, you have pi, tau, alpha. You'll get hepta, right, to the number 7. So 7 is a Sabbath, but the day of the flame, and it's also associated with Hephaestus, right, in that there's 7 sentinels that carry the torches of fire at night in Book 9. And then in addition, Hephaestus comes and he burns the Trojans in Book 21, or the 7th book of the 3rd act, the 777. And heptak is 7 times, and compared to the name associated with Memphis, like this hikupta, right? It's like this heptak. It's similar. It's almost like it's been reversed, and it's a corrupted form. Or it could just like add an esoteric level to it, right, in this Babylonic sense that it's confusing. So imagine Memphis is like heptakis, or it essentially means 7, or maybe it's like 70. It's like the 70 elders of the Israelites, or the 7 sentinels. So I'm not sure it's a corruption in that. I think the name of Hephaestus in this Pathal or whatever is kind of like a riddle or mnemonic device. And you have the phonic meaning of this phi plus alpha, or maybe it's like or of the phi, right? Because the phonetic letters come from pictograms, and it's like there's like snakes on a pictogram, so you can probably get multiple meanings of this cult. The pictograms are like a lot. It's like a composite, right? Because it's like how this god probably interacts with all these other gods and stuff, and there's a lot of esoteric meaning, right, that comes from all these pictures, the hieroglyphs, and it's also probably a way to confuse people in this Babylonic sense. Like one can come and change the letters, like a Phoenician or Semitic, if he understood the hieroglyphs, he could change it to this more easier to read, this linear language. and he can change the common language, which was probably closely guarded or was made kind of confusing on purpose in the first place, or maybe it was just controlled. Not everyone had the right to language. And then you create this kind of new ethno-linguistic branch, right? It's not, you don't even necessarily have to create a new ethnic group. You could have just a new linguistic branch of people who speak a new language, right? And you can't control these people. They leave your system. And the hieroglyphs themselves are like composites. You can kind of understand, right, where the mythical language at least comes from, right? The letters are these combinations of images and other symbolic lettering, right? Composites of epithets, anamorphic ideolatry, and early phonetic lettering, right? These Egyptian hieroglyphs are like this half. This guy's like a half falcon or something, and then he's like there's like snakes in the corner, and then there's birds in the sky and squiggly lines, and that's just like one letter or vocalization, and together these pictographs form words, and then you can make sentences, and eventually you'll get to understand a god. And it makes sense. The gods are like many symbols and animals and epithets that we associate with them. And we can even associate these epithets or naming conventions with whole civilizations, like Egypt. And Homeric Greek, Hephaestus' name is spelled like this. But there are many different spellings, and that's kind of my theory, is that in Book 9 and 10, when you're creating that steel sword in the furnace, it's like a metaphor for the creation of letters and language. And the name Hephaestus itself is this mnemonic device or poem to remember letters in the alphabet. And by mnemonic device, I think it's like the Egyptian Python, that Hephaestus is literally, I think he's literally like Fa, like this E phi alpha epsilon, right? This EPHAE. The Fa is the son of Eta or H, right? Today it'd be like F is the son of H, or in Spanish it might be a little better because it's phonetic. So like Hephaestus is Sto, right? So it's like Fa, or the F is the son of the H, or the Greek Eta is like the Spanish H. So like it's like the riddle. Why 6 afraid of 7? Well, because 7, 8, 9. So you see how this like short poem not only provides humor, it's a kind of device to remember the order of the alphabet for probably like these scribal young scribes who are training to learn the mythos. Taking a look at Hephaestus in Homeric Greek, how it's spelled, it means 9, which makes sense in that Hephaestus is like a unique god in Greek myths, right? He is like Python, but he's his own god. And in the Iliad, he's associated, I think, with number 9, yeah. In the Iliad itself, number 9 is important. It takes 9 years for Achilles to kind of get his armor. It's in Book 18, these 2 9s that Hephaestus makes it for him. And then also in that Book 18, it's Hephaestus who talks about how he spent 9 years with Achilles' mother Thetis, and then also Eurynome. He spent 9 years after he got thrown from Olympus by Zeus. So again, this 9 is important to not only the Greek myths, but Hephaestus. So even though on an esoteric level, he's still kind of associated with 7, I think, as this like relic of Egypt and the Neolithic. It's the 9 that is associated on this more surface level with the Trojan War. So Hephaestus in Greek, I take it comes from this like iaptho or aptho, which means I kindle light, or this like to kindle a fire. And you make like a more complex word from that. So it's apthastios or hapthastios, which is without stumbling or falling. So apthastios is like without stumbling. It's like an earnest, like work in earnest, or to be hired as this contract labor, like where you're kind of being watched over by this fiery eye of those stonecutter masons. But it would also be somewhat ironic or kind of humorous that the lame gimp Hephaestus means without stumbling. But the apstastios, right, it could just, that A is like a negating, so it could also mean stumbling, right? That he's both without and he stumbles. But I think Hephaestus is kind of like symbolic in that he is kind of a gimp, incorruptible. He bangs the metal into shape, and it's malleable. He does it without stumbling. He's an earnest worker. He's going to earn his wages. So perhaps and it's haptho, which means the light. It's almost like pthal or something, but it's kind of been jumbled up, or it's like read backwards, and that's kind of, you would suggest maybe this is like this error in the Semitic interpretation of reading right to left as opposed to the Greek left to right, and like patha is like patha is a composite word itself formed from phonetic symbology for vocalizations of pictograms. So you can understand the pictogram maybe was read the wrong way, and it was projected onto this linear language where the order matters, right? That's kind of like an inherent problem, is that if you're reading off this like non-linear script and then you translate into this linear script, it can be confusion, but and that also can compound if you make other words from it. But also this can be done on purpose. There's some power there if you're like a scribe or a censor or something. you can figure out ways. But there's also a double-edged sword, right? You can figure out ways to create language. But it's like the Tower of Babel. You'd rather have a unified language than this confused language of multiple meanings. Maybe in Egypt the sound is distinct from the these snake sounds basically were interpreted into these hieroglyphs or off these hieroglyphs by the Phoenicians and then turned into letters or blocks of letters, right, in this linear script. And the patha is like the snake sound or that we would recognize as the this ph that we when we search patha, it's not patha, right? It's like the Greeks understood it as pi or phi theta alpha. So it's like almost like that's how you get this F, right? The FA, the EPHAE in the English script of Hephaestus. This FA. And then you add the stos, and the stos is like store and Nestor, right? It's like this son of. It's the naming scheme, the son of. And once again, I think of Hephaestus as like a child's riddle. It's F is the son of Eta, or F is the son of H. And stos comes from like a portico, but it's like really stoic or stoa, where stoa is a colonnade or a portico or a covered walkway. And that comes from stoa. So the A is like this negating. So it's like a non-covered walkway, and then you cover it. And that's interesting because when you compare it to Bezalel, Bezalel is the guy who makes the tabernacle. He means in the shadow of God, so it's kind of like this portico. So Bezalel is on the end, right? He's at the end, so he's like, it's like this naming scheme almost. Again, from Exodus, it's Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur. It's kind of like this poem. Bezalel means in the shadow of God, to quiver, sink, or grow dark in front of God. You've been covered up, right, by this portico. And then that you build, it's kind of like a temple, or maybe it's like that they understood it's like the kiln. Hephaestus likely comes from the tribe of Naphtali, where naphtha is an extremely flammable gas or oily liquid that allows you to readily make fire. It's not to make the metal itself, it's not the fuel for the metal, but it's the ability to light lamps and get a fire started, right, to kindle the fire. And it allows you to work at night, and you have access to ready fire. That's what Naphtali brings, and how we associate Hephaestus with fire. Naphtali joins with the line of Judah and the Levites, and fire, right? Naphtali is like this peat material, or he's like this easily lit organic material, and that's how we know the burning bush. The Naphtali tribe controlled that resource, this like peat or some kind of material that's easily burned, that would be profitable or valuable in this late Bronze Age or early Iron Age. And then Naphtali is also important because he joins with the line of Judah and Aaron, right, the Levites. So like the line of Judah, and Aaron, the line of the Levites, they hold up the staff of Moses, and the staff comes from, of course, the burning bush, from Yahweh, but it comes out of the burning bush. So it's probably like this Naphtali tribe, this craftsman group, but they also control the fire, the tribe of Naphtali, and that's where you get this Hephaestus. And likewise, Her is like Diomedes, or maybe Diomedes is like Uri in that Diomedes is the son of Tydides. It's a rhyming scheme if you read it like in the native language, and we can link Diomedes and Tydides to the tribe of Judah, where the grandfather of Diomedes is Oeneus, who is like Judah, and that Oeneus brings the teaching of winemaking. So in that respect, he is like Judah, or of the line of Judah. The trio of Agamemnon, Diomedes, and Nestor represent a new political order where power has to be ceded. The sword they are making is going to cut the power of Agamemnon, right? The sword represents the cutting of power, and this is where courts and courtyard or garden comes from, right? This extension of the palace. It's this rosy exterior, but it's just ornamentation for the brutality of justice, right? If it's fair or not. And Spanish to cut is corte or cortes. In English, we know it similar as court. And the Spanish court literally means to cut. And we get it probably from Greek, where, interestingly, dioko means to I persecute, I seek, where the root is cut or court, which is kairo in Greek, right? So Diomedes is like a prosecutor. He seeks people out. But this entails seeking people out who flee. So he's like a marshal or a CIA agent, or like a prosecutor in one. It's also interesting that both these corte and cairo, the Spanish corte and the Greek cairo, are in reference to cutting the hair. So maybe it's a way to distinguish who has been persecuted or like someone who is a free man. Taking a step away from the naming conventions, we can say books 9 and 10 of the Iliad are contained within the books of Exodus, roughly chapters 18 through 31, up until the Golden Calf. So the time period in Exodus is where you have the formation of the Ten Commandments for the first time. Laws of justice and mercy, and those dealing with property rights are given. The covenant is confirmed, and consecrated, and the confirmation of the priest is done, and then there's the laying out of the courtyard, the lamps, the altar, the tabernacle, the incense, the priestly garments, etc. This is where the religion is really made, and it's like tangible, and how the consent or the material is manufactured. Or through the building of all these Iron Age or Bronze Age religious temples and ornaments and other sites, you are building the church itself, right? Civilization, the place where people will worship and live and produce materials, right? But also it serves as a metaphor for different aspects of the race, or just in general the Israelites as their culture. Right? They're a confederation of tribes that are not indivisible, right? They're not this block or stone, and they might act like one, but their parts itself the parts itself are not divided into these equal dimensions. They're measured out, and they're specific to what different kind of like function, right? Just different like things, like the lamp and the tabernacle are not the same dimensions or measurements. So some are bigger or have different roles within the religion or manufacture of this kind of material. There's a hierarchy and also a process, and that process is the religion. Through dedication and fervor for following the rules or process, you'll end up with the religion, but one that works. You can't half-ass the religion. Today we understand people by what they wear. Like a suit is the biggest indicator someone is involved in kind of like a job that involves money or commerce, or even like law. Or at least at one time it was, and now it just kind of means you've adopted this Athenian democracy, right? It's synonymous with Western civilization. You're wearing these religious garbs of jersey of democracy, depending on your role, function in society, and kind of material you can generate or produce yourself to, acquire this stuff, these garbs. There's also the political side of it, where the customs and laws are made in addition to the courtyard, which makes sense, that being that Athena features heavily in Book 10 especially, and Agamemnon has to cede some power to the priestly class of Nestor and his sons, but it's also this new intelligence or special forces that Diomed and Odysseus make up, and Agamemnon has no choice. He's without Achilles. To get him back, he tries to offer the bribes and all that, he has to pay for the military backing or just reparations for stealing Achilles' woman. So, reminiscent of Exodus, the religious buildings and customs laws are kept in order by taxes, and this is collected or maintained by this intelligence wing of the military, sentinels. This is where the sentinels come in, where the cult of Hephaestus also comes in, right? The labor rackets, the stonemasons, the smithies, the laborers in general kind of interface with the cults of Athena, right? Justice, intelligence, naval prowess, or just seafaring ability in trade in general. In Exodus, Yahweh or God requires stuff from the people in order to build a tabernacle. They need to create something because the Pharaoh or Achilles is gone. Right? And in Exodus, this moment occurs when Jethro comes back to visit Moses, and Jethro makes Moses realize he has to cede the power to lower classes, or at least appear to make the concessions in order to more tightly censor the Israelites. A new court is made then, and it's like a new court or cut is made for this Athena-like goddess, right? The pretty face to the ugly face of capitalism, brutal arm of justice. We think of Athena, we think of like the god of wisdom, but she really is like this social justice warrior in reality. Moses does this in order to ultimately maintain power, because the Israelites are not always obedient to Moses or appreciative of him, and that they suffered a lot and don't always have the religious belief to press along with the struggle. You see how Moses has to form something new, right? He has to give up some power in the process, or at least he has to act like he does, and he does so by creating the court system. Is the goddess of justice and courts, and this is to more effectively manage this like ragtag group of people. It's like this, and it's done in a seemingly fair way, right? Of democracy in courts and all this. Similarly, this is where we find Agamemnon in Book 9, where Book 9 is like Book 1 in that, well, Chryseis is not there. It's the same effect that Nestor, or Chryseis is not there. It's the same effect that Nestor rebukes Agamemnon about stealing Briseis, which was ultimately because Chryseis was taken away in Book 1. So Agamemnon, like like similarly in Books 1 and 2, he's kind of has to own up to this, and he has to cede power to the lower classes. And in particular, it's the priestly classes and the courts, right? He needs to form a new religion or kind of a military strategy without Achilles. So he relies on Nestor to be able to bring the troops home, but also out for that to happen, right? Agamemnon has to admit to Nestor that he's right about stealing Briseis, like apologizing or admitting that he's wrong. It's difficult for Agamemnon, but it's important, and that he kind of he cedes power to the priest, right? That they know better. Moreover, the customs and laws of the Iliad are explicated metaphorically, like they say a person is like a lion and how they pounce on someone and they kill them. They kill that person as if that person was like a 1-year-old calf or something, right? Whereas in the book of Exodus, it's more direct. It's like you need to provide the Lord with a year-old calf. It's just straightforward as a tax, right? It's part of building the new religion, this new priestly class. They need garbs and all this kind of stuff, right? And the church or temple, it's this new organization. And Nestor chides Agamemnon for stealing Briseis from Achilles, and rightfully so. And Agamemnon has to admit he's wrong. It's one of the commandments that you can't steal people's wives or covet thy neighbor. Another example of this kind of like metaphorical or just kind of poetic telling of the commandments, and it's not so like it's not done in this like listicle or list of in the fashion of Exodus, right? This like block of this like 10 commandments in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, So Agamemnon always brings up Tydeus, or he says Diomedes, son of Tydides, and it's because Diomed is the son of Tydeus, and it's more so that Tydeus was like an epic guy. He was one of the legendary 7 against thieves. So like the commandments, you have to respect your father, and because Agamemnon knows that, right? He needs to get the best out of this Diomedes character, and he needs to win the locker room. So Diomedes, he has to respect the tradition of his father, and that's like to be a great heroic soldier. And Agamemnon knows that. He pushes his buttons. Respect your father, and that's kind of what this son of Tydeus, or at least with respect to Diomedes, right? To push his buttons. And compare this to how Agamemnon interacts with Odysseus as this intermediary, or this intermediary to Achilles, right? And he sends bribes to Achilles covertly through Odysseus, and the bribes are like the golden tripods and other materials like silver. You need these materials to get a warrior like Achilles, and eventually Achilles does come back, and it's his shield and armor that are built by Hephaestus. And Odysseus' name is the bringer of wrath, or one who brings suffering, but it's more so, I think, from Odine. He's the one to suffer. Like, he brings the suffering on himself almost. It's kind of like in this, right, it's like in a heroic fashion. So we have to remember that Odysseus is a descendant of Hermes, and Hermes, it roughly translates to no pun intended, he's the best interpreter. So Hermes literally means best interpreter or best translator. So we can think of Odysseus like he's like this translator, or maybe he's like a negotiator, field agent for the CIA, an interpreter. He knows all the languages. He's kind of like a pirate too, so he needs to know the languages. He's on the sea and he's sailing around, and then he goes to Achilles, and Odysseus is the one who suffers. In that he doesn't get what he wants in this straightforward way. So he's like bound to complete his task in this like roundabout odyssey, right? Like this CIA action thriller. He's like, he has to do all this crazy stuff when he could have just got it done. Like the beginning of the movie, he could have just, like, the ending's there in the movie, but then it, like, something happens, and he ends up having to do this crazy, like, 24-hour thriller. But also, we gotta think of it just, he's like a shrewd negotiator, and he understands people's languages, and not just kind of this palatial caste of Agamemnon or the priestly caste of the Athenian cult. He's the best translator or interpreter, like his ancestor Hermes. But Hermes is a thief, and Odysseus too. So, like, the olive branch doesn't mean peace. So when he goes to Achilles, you got to understand that basically he's kind of like, I think basically they thieve the language in God's kind, right? In this part, right? Agamemnon needs to kind of create his own religion that's similar to Moses, right? He needs to create his own kind of thing. He needs to either get Achilles back, or he needs to mimic it. Achilles is like the pharaoh, and if comparing to Exodus, perhaps, like Odysseus, like Joshua, when he goes to scout the land, right? He's negotiating kind of these new trade routes to circumvent the Egyptians, and likewise, Odysseus, when he goes to offer Achilles bribes, it's to gain access, like, to Dardanelles and trade that would come with controlling Troy, right? If he sacked Troy and got Achilles on board, it's like he brings the olive branch, but the olive branch doesn't necessarily mean peace, because he's a thief. So it's like he's the thief of language and God, trying to create their own. I interpret, like, if you interpret this in Exodus, that Moses is kind of, they've thieved the language from the Egyptians, and their gods kind of like these. They're trying to create like their own composite gods, and they have their own, but they're trying to create their own, and they do it through censoring and encrypting it down to what we know, like in the classic literature, that we're kind of left with what they've censored, right? We don't know what was before it, in a sense. So going back to Odysseus, like, language is important. Maps, technology, education, intelligence in general, and that's kind of what Odysseus is like. Like I said, he's kind of like this. He's kind of like a, I don't know what to say. He's like a CIA field agent, right? He's a glowy, because things require raw materials, and even religion, real or not. Like, we need materials, materialism. The tabernacle is the shield of Achilles, and all the other artifacts built in tandem with the tabernacle, like the lamps, the armor, any of all that stuff that's created for Achilles or the tabernacle, all materials that you need. And for that, you need, right? You need kind of like this intelligence apparatus to go out and secure these trade routes and stuff. Basically, you need allies in the area, and the best way to do that is kind of through these shrewd negotiators and probably like nefarious clandestine operations. field agents that are behind enemy lines. Furthermore, let's look at the trio of Hur, Aaron, and Moses, how they work together effectively as like this back and forth dynamic that ultimately can hold together. These oscillations bind this tripartite type model into this singularity, right? The locker room of Diomed, the press or PR machine of Nestor, and then the coach or management of Agamemnon, right? Together, they're a team with a logo. All right, they're this monolith, and they just want to win. And Achilles is the star player who's holding out for more bucks, right, in this contract. But eventually, the itch of the competitor is stronger than the money. And there's also kind of this time aspect to the money that the value drops with his age. So Achilles, he comes back eventually, and he gets his new armor, a new contract. But it's not like if he came back earlier in the season, right? So Agamemnon, after quickly talking with Menelaus, finds the person he's really looking for. It's Nestor, and he wakes him up. And after he's awoken, after Nestor is awoken, he puts his clothes on, which are like the robes that Aaron has made for him, right? The Levite, the priestly class of the Hebrews. And it's interesting today that the priest class is like the judges and the courts and the DAs and the prosecutors, and kind of like the deep state. And like the deep state is like this obscured fin of the tuna, this Aphareus, and the judges, they wear like this robe, and they're more like up front, right? We understand them as kind of this cult of Athena, the cult of the judges. They're like this Levantine or this Leviathan of the deep state or the Justice Department, the Pentagon, right? There is something to this kind of like deep state. And it's interesting that Athena is also associated with like the sea, because you need like the Justice Department or the Pentagon to go to war. You need strategy. In addition, you also need the press of Nestor, right, who's going to provide that interface. That the suits help too, although the judge robes are somewhat peculiar, but they distinguish themselves with this priestly higher class. If you see somebody in a judge's robe, you understand their place in society. While they try to present as peers, judges act like they're peers, and that's kind of like it's like in a sense that is kind of like how they are cryptic in that, because they are of a higher class than us, but they act as peers. And Athena is kind of that paradox, or at least that kind of frontward facing, that nice face of this kind of brutal arm of justice. And then Odysseus goes into his tent and gets like his jersey. And if we're going with the analogy of sports, he's like a new breakout player. He's like this new player who can do all kinds of stuff. He's like a running quarterback. And Agamemnon is like the owner or GM, right? And he needs to figure out a way to use Odysseus. And Diomed is the locker room. And he's asleep, and Nestor wakes him up, right? And that's important because most people don't care about politics or sports. Diomed is like that, in that he's the medium opinion. It's socially made available in the fact that it's like it's forced on people, right? They'll kick you when you're asleep. And football or the Super Bowl is like a religious experience. It happens on Sunday. You kind of have no choice to participate in the revelry either, like a Super Bowl party or something. Just watching the Super Bowl, there's really no escaping it. Furthermore, Diomed remarks that Nestor never sleeps, it appears. So it's like the news, the narrative never stops, and at night, that's when the narrative's crafted. It's either what you're hearing or it's getting crafted at night in like these small offices. There's like as soon as in the morning you hear what's happened at night. And it's very few people ultimately control the narrative compared to the crowd or populace of citizens. Nestor says it's a matter of life or death ultimately. His priestly class depends on this existentialism in a sense. He needs to kind of be up always at night or worrying about keeping the narrative on people. Even if he's asleep and he gets woken up by surprise news, he has to be ready to jump on people. And it hangs on the edge of the razor, right? This Diomedes. And that's chosen. The narrative is chosen to split people. It's this Diomedean debate. And then Diomed puts on his jersey, the lion skin, and he goes out to seek out the lower ranking members, the fellow captains, and he's compared to sheepdogs watching the flock. again, we can think of Diomedes as Her, or of the line of Her and Judah. So, like the line of Judah, he's kind of like Heracles too, who I associate with Jacob. And Jacob wears the goat skin, but Heracles wears like this lion skin, and Judah is associated with the lion skin, and Diomed puts on the lion skin. And then Diomed goes to find Meriones, the meridian divider, the line of division effectively for like the lower ranking members, the men on the watch, these captains, these lower tier members. And the religion or race needs direction and on all kind of orders of the magnitude, or within like the levels of the structure, right down from the top to the bottom. And that you need that coherency, and that comes from effective management and communication, especially at these kind of interfaces, right? And that's why these kind of like these characters, these minor characters, can be important. That these delegates of power, right? And they get responsibility and they pass it on to minor figures, and they represent these divisions of power. And the debate ends with basically what we know today. The journalist or any low tier member of society wishes to get their hands on a pot of gold to impress his boss, or right. It's like the player who wants to make a name for themselves on a team and score a big contract. We all this nothing's changed since the Bronze Age as far as what motivates like the normal person, or what's fed to people as what should motivate them. Impressing your boss and getting a increase in your wages. And Odysseus and Diomed are about to leave on their reconnaissance mission, and Homer writes what I think is probably the most interesting of the passages in Book 9 and 10. It's like a similar passage in Book 2, but like the progression into the poem itself, you become more engrossed in the details. I imagine during the night that takes place in Book 9 and 10 of the Iliad is the Greeks craft this iron sword, which itself is a metaphor for the creation of language or words or letters, and religion, education, and kind of this societal evolution. We're kind of entering this new age or phase, and the sword or iron itself to make steel is the edge they need. That new word or letter that adds some ambiguity or kind of shrouds themselves in this cryptic mysteriousness. It's the edge to use to cut and create these new lesser appendages of the larger centralized power of Agamemnon, right? They provide some cover in that they make people think that there's a division of power, or there's some delegation of it, or like you have some say, or you have a vote, but in reality it's just cover. It's just this facade. And that's hangs on this razor thin balance, and it's to control the narrative on either side. And the sword represents that new technology, right? That Hephaestus, the craft god, creates. And it's along with it comes language, science, and trade that make civilization progression possible, or at least in the sense of democracy, right? That all these things kind of interact. Even today, if you park a aircraft carrier off some state's coast, right, you're going to be able to negotiate trade, but also you're going to start introducing your language, and you're going to make them adopt your science, right? And like technology isn't necessarily always good, but it's like on the forefront of all this, and it's related to Athena and Hephaestus, but also kind of below the surface, Hermes. So let's read from Book 10 of the Iliad. They then put on their armor. Brave Thrasymedes provided the son of Tydeus with a sword and a shield, for he had left his own at his ship, and on his head he set a helmet of bull's hide without either peak or crest. It's called a skull cap, and is common headgear. Meriones found a bow and quiver for Odysseus, and on his head he set a leathern helmet that was lined with a strong plating of leathern thongs, while on the outside it was thickly studded with boar's teeth, well and skillfully set into it. Next the head there was an inner lining of felt. This helmet had been stolen by Autolycus out of Ilion when he broke into the house of Amnitor, son of Ormenos. He gave it to Amphidamas of Cythera to take to Scandeia, and Amphidamas gave it to guest gift to Molos, who gave it to his son Meriones, and now it was set upon the head of Odysseus. So this is like a really important passage, and there's a lot of esoteric kind of symbology, or there's a lot of names and places. So within that, there's like more than one meaning. So let's dig into it as far as the people and places. So Thrasymedes is the son of Nestor. Literally, he means bold of thought. So he provides Diomed with a sword and shield. So think of it like an argument, or like this bold, what seems like a bold thought, right? Or some popular dialect is something to kind of get people distracted. It's chosen on this razor edge, right? It's chosen. The sword blade, that bold thought of Thrasymedes. It provides the media the edge or extreme of the debate, the tips of this new appendage of the centralized Agamemnon, right? It's the frontier. Also, he's the shield that provides cover. The argument is fake. It's not meant to leave the priestly class of Nestor and his sons, or like translate to the Bible, Aaron, right, the Levite, and his sons in the blame. They don't want to be blamed for it, so it's a shield. They always win the argument. And Thrasymedes, again, he's like, so Diomedes is like the locker room, so Thrasymedes is kind of like the locker room blow up, and then he causes a team meeting which ultimately rallies the team, right? It's this, that blow up gives you that passion and the motivation, kind of like when you're 3/4 of the way through the season to get through it. So, in addition, both Thrasymedes and Diomedes both share the same suffix ending to their name, Medes, which I think it takes two meanings. One, median or media, right, in between, we know that. And relaying that today, something like a dialectic or dichotomy, or again, the locker room in sports. But it can also literally be a Mede, someone from Mede, or this place called Media, the space in between northern and southern Persia, or Iran, that we know today, Iran. Most people know the Medes or Medians as Persians, but before they were Persians, they were the Medes, and before that, they were the Aryans. So, furthermore, possibly we can see Thrasymedes as like this precursor to what the Romans would call the Mithraism or Zoroastrian that comes from Persia, or the land of the Medes. And Mede itself is like it means a magician, and that the Aryans didn't become the Medians until Medea, the sorceress, is said to go there. And Medea literally means schemer or planner. So she's a sorcerer or magician. And I'd argue he represents Thracian Mede territory, right? This extreme extent of the Median Empire, or possibly they understood kind of where the steel making came from. This Thrace, it was like the frontier of Europe, where they understood Europe started. And likewise, Diomedes would be this demarcation of the empire itself. He cuts the Medes in half, or is the Median itself, the space in between North and South Iran, or Aryan territory that it was called before the Medes. And going further, you could argue Agamemnon's name derives from the summer capital of the Median Empire, Ecbatana. In Elamite, it's Agmadana. In Middle Persian, Parthian, Amadan. So it's believed that Ecbatana is in Hagmatanya Hill, an archaeological mound in Hamadan. And this is probably where we get the Italian montagna, right? And the Spanish montagna, right? Mountain or mount. So if I'm right, if my theory is kind of right, that this Agamemnon comes from this Median summer capital of Hagmatanya or Ecbatana. And according to Herodotus, Ecbatana was chosen as the Medes' capital in the late 8th century BC by somebody called Deioces. So you can see that this Diomedes is like this Deioces kind of character by splitting the capital of the Median Empire, the dominant power of the time of Homer. So this Deioces guy split the Median Empire in two, with a winter and summer capital. And this is most likely the background for which Homer was writing, or grew up in, as an Ionian, right? He grew up near Anatolia, with the Trojan War as the surface level, or the foreground, right? It's the main plot of the story of the Iliad, but kind of this esoteric background, I think, is the Median Empire. And Diomedes and Deioces are like Diocletian, right? That we know from the Romans, and that they bring this secession of power and reorganizing and reshuffling of the decks. Going further, we could say the The prefix thrasa from Thrasymedes come from thra, to shatter or crush, and basically he's probably like to thrash or thrush. And combining, we could say Thrasymedes means to break or thrash the middle, which makes sense in that he provides a sword to Diomedes. The two middles are the dialectic, and the sword is to provide the razor's edge for an argument to balance on, but it's also to smash you, crush you over the head with, so you accept the narrative. But ultimately, it allows Agamemnon to sack Troy, right? It's this new tech, probably iron making, the ability to make steel, and a new tech in that the sword is the bold thought that Thrasymedes is known as, right? It's this bold or new thought. I interpret new letter, also a new alphabet, or the understanding of the conscious nature of myth and society in general, or just the natural world. We can't control the sun, we can't control how many hours, but we can make stuff like fire and candles, and then we can go and make steel to make brass more stronger, right? We can we can craft a world that we live in, and that extends to religion itself. Or maybe you can say that it's an extension of religion, right? Religion should be central. So you create your own world and universe, in a sense. The arguments are never organic, not even the language, because it's constructed, devised by a small number of elite people for their own meaning. And our understanding of the symbols is to keep us chugging along. It's to keep us putzing around, barking at one another like dogs, and not really getting to the root of the story, the moral of the story. So language can unite us, but it also is used to confuse and divide us. Diomedes uses the sword to thrash or crush the Medians, similar to those who are superior in rhetoric when in an argument. But nowadays, with schooling so prevalent, it's been somewhat muddled, right? Rhetoric is kind of like, everyone knows rhetoric devices, even if they don't know how to apply it. So it's kind of like big midwit. It's hard to kind of drown out the noise to find the kind of the true signal. Next, Odysseus is given a bow and arrows from Meriones, this dividing line, the meridian. And Meriones is the people or lower station of power, the lieutenants or captains maybe. Going further, I identify Meriones as like the Mitanni, or commonly called the Akkadian Hurrians, or the Marianu by the Hittites. So the Hittites call them the Marianu, and the Akkadians call them the Hurrians. And it's probably where we get her and like Hernando and Ferrari and stuff like that, right? And to me, Marianu sounds like Meriones. So it's ultimately I came to the conclusion. But ultimately, I came to this conclusion through the Bible. I didn't just think like, oh, it's Marianu. It's because of Exodus. Like I interpret Homer understood the Mitanni or Hurrians as this creator of the bow and arrow. But also going back to Meriones' role in the Sentinels, there's these additional 100 youths. So in Homer's Greek, Hekatos means 100, and it's analogous to this Hekaton, which means far shooting, which is like an epithet for a bow, right? This far shooting device. And that the 100 youths really get down to the far reaching places. They're like a bow and arrow, this long distance weapon, a metaphor probably for the psychological as opposed to the physical approach of Diomedes and his thrashing sword of Thrasymedes. And in Exodus 31, Uri's the son of Hur, and Hur has himself a son, Bezalel, who ends up being like a smithy making the tabernacle and all the crap for the Israelites. So Hur and Uri in combination, maybe they're like the Hurrians, right? Or perhaps just Hur himself is the Hurrians and Uri the Urartu, this neighboring civilization, leaving Bezalel, who I'm not 100% sure, but I'm thinking it's Babylon. So I think, like the Bible itself is not very clear in who Hur is. I mean, they mention who Hur by name, but it could be that there's multiple Hur, so it's not. So it's somewhat difficult to identify him exactly in the Homeric tradition. So because the Iliad it's much longer than just Exodus, where Exodus has about 33,000 words. The Iliad has about 150,000, so it's nearly 5 times as many words, which is most likely from the fact that all the gods and goddesses and demigods are taken out and censored from the Bible. So you're left with this remnants of this like polytheism with the monotheistic Yahweh. in the Bible. Or I don't know if that explains it, because you have to consider, which I've argued, is that the Iliad is this compendium of sorts containing more than just the Exodus, right? Compared to the 24 book catalog of the Jewish Bible. The Jewish Bible is more than just Exodus itself, which is the most important point in conclusion being that myths are subjective, right? Where do they start? Where do they begin? Is it just one story? Or is it? It's all up for interpretation. And although there are parts that are relics of the earlier Bronze Age and Neolithic, again, that are set in stone, I think there's these hymns and prayers and epithets and symbology that they have to stay there, or else the myths are not coherent and they're not going to make sense. But there's obviously censorship, making it difficult to trace all these genealogies, which Hebrew scholars will even agree with. Point being, Her is somewhat of an ambiguous figure who, while I identify him with Diomedes, it's still confusing because of the patronymic naming device of Diomedes, son of Tydides. It's this rhyming scheme that's probably on purpose, like it's this cryptic nature that both to help the scribe in training, but also to add levels of esoteric symbology. But we do know what's written, so it's best to just analyze what we have. So we do know some about Bezalel, and in that he's interesting because he has the ability from God to change the alphabet, which I interpret as one of the stories, right, of Book 9 and 10, is this conscious creation of letters and words and language. So that's why I interpret him as Babylon. It's just like this confusing character who, through the Spirit of God, changes the language, creates more than just one, and then confuses the people in the process. That's how I understand Hephaestus. The name has this etymological meaning, but it also has this kind of literary device within it, embedded in. Likewise, I interpret Bezalel, son of Uri, Uri, son of Hor, in the same fashion as all that. And it's like Nestor, son of Neleus, and Diomedes, son of Tydeus, right? It's ways to understand the alphabet by placing two similar sounding letters next to each other as a way to make one remember the difference, right? This training for the scribes. But again, there's also more embedded in that. It's their symbology. That's how you add meaning. Going further, it makes sense. Book 9 and Book 10 is all about intelligence gathering, education, but also progress and evolution. Progress, it's in this kind of like democratic sense that everyone, or you have to know everything about everyone. This creation of new letters, new metals, and these rhyming schemes help cement the new mythos and keep hidden the true esoteric meaning to those who are in the know, right? And that the myths itself tell us the spread of technology of metal making in addition to language, but also like genealogical migrations of people. And you come to the conclusion that the pen is mightier than the sword. And all this kind of motivates me to believe that Tydeus represents Tyre, or he represents the god of Tyre, the city where Europa was abducted by Zeus and taken to Crete, creating the alphabet in the process. So you see this myth is probably embedded in here that, well, the myth of Zeus abducting Europa, you can see how that's probably taken from Hur and Uri, right? This Europa. And going further, the Bible had Bezalel as the one who creates the language in new letters, as the son of Hur, or the Hurrians. And carrying that logic, Homer has that the Medians would then be given their language through Diomedes, or maybe they understood Medea as bringing the phonetic alphabet to the Aryans, and after which they became associated with the Median language, right? If you read, I think it's like Jason and the Argonauts. And then Diomedes maybe then is an import, right? He's like a later import, as Homer knows him, right? He knows him as a Median. Hur is from the line of Judah, which in turn is of the line of Abraham, right? Abraham is in Genesis. And where I have identified Perseus as Abraham from the book of Genesis. So Perseus and Abraham I see as analogous characters. And this would make sense that Diomedian is this Median or Persian, and that Perseus is said to have a son, Perses, the first king of Persia, or somehow that the kingship of Persia ends up in the son of Perseus. And that's how they got their name. And they're not, we don't know them as the Medians anymore, right? And again, Perseus is analogous to Abraham, thus related to the line of Judah and Hur. So going full circle, her and Diomedes are like one and the same, right? They have this Persian or Median connection, I argue. Again, the books of Exodus and Numbers are unclear, though, and whether the her mentioned in either are the same, but they're similar if we look at them through the character of Diomedes in the Iliad, I say. So, specifically, the spying mission that Joshua and Caleb spearhead that ends with the 10 other Israelites getting killed and only Caleb and Joshua being blessed by God. And so Joshua is like Odysseus and Caleb like Diomedes, and that Caleb is the son of Hor, right? And that they're the only two that come back rewarded from the reconnaissance mission for keeping true to God. Or in the Iliad, they pray to Athena, right? Blessed by Athena. And Caleb, again, is the son of Hor, so we can think again, the son of Hor probably is something like Tydides, or son of Tydides, meaning Diomed, right? Like this rhyming scheme. And then going back to Book 10 of the Iliad and finishing the passage I just started earlier. Next the head there was an inner lining of felt. This helmet had been stolen by Autolycus out of Ilion when he broke into the house of Amnitor, son of Ormenos. He gave it to Amphidamas of Cythera to take it to Scandea, and Amphidamas gave it as a guest to Molos, who gave it to his son Meriones, and now it is set upon the head of Odysseus. So let's go through all the names of people and places and their etymologies individually, and then make sense of kind of this whole passage here, because it's really important. But I think the names and people each have multiple meanings, right? The etymologies are important. So let's go. First mentioned is Autolycus. This literally, well, his name literally means the wolf. He's the wolf itself, right? It's auto, the same as, and then Lycos is wolf. So he's like a wolf, or maybe they can understand him as the Lycians or the Lycians. And the helmet mentioned is stolen out of Ilion or Helena, so it's probably similar to Helen or of Sparta. It's probably a good analogy. Would be here maybe that Helen is like Europa-like figure, and that she's stolen, right? And that books 9 and 10 are about language, and then she's captured from Greece and brought to Anatolia, right? That we know that Helen was stolen from Sparta, and then she was brought to Troy by Paris. Or maybe it's the opposite, right? That Helen is going to be stolen away from Troy in the middle of the night. So let's keep going. So going further into the passage, when he broke into the house of Amnitor of Ormenides. In Greek, Amnitor is defender, and Ormenides means son of Ormenos, where Edes is like son, or son of, right? So Ormenides means son of Ormenos, which I interpret two ways, just by going by the words. You have the prefix oros, which is mountain, and the suffix meno or menin, which is to restrain or abide or remain true. So combining the two, you have this immovable mountain, this defensive stronghold, I imagine, of rhetoric that protected the language, Elenos or Helen in Sparta. Additionally, you could interpret Ormenides as Hermes, so as this impulse or violent motion, as one of the steersmen. And then it's also, it also means as of the steersman of a vessel. So maybe like this rash kind of impulse to pull on the wheel of a boat, which can make sense to this impulse or to set in motion. Or even more interestingly is this association, again, with the steering of a boat, which plays along with Athena and Nancy, both these sea gods, but more importantly, these gods of like the seafaring people, fishermen and sailors. And going even further, the next character is Amphidamas, where amphi means around on both sides, so like an amphibian, right? It's both land and water. And damas can mean damazo, to subdue. So combining amphi and damas, you can get to subdue from both sides or all around. There's another possibility in that Damas shares the root with Damascus or Damascus, right? The city in Syria that we know of today. And Damascus is known as the city of jasmine, but also it can mean well-watered. So at the time, Damascus might have been a well-watered city, or that through either irrigation or just the natural climate, it
it was more well watered than today, and then through kind of desertification, it has become this kind of desert, right? Additionally, in Spanish or Portuguese, Damascus or Damasco is apricot. Literally, apricot means Damascus, right? The city. Where apricot is this anglicized form of the more recognizable, or I argue more recognizable Italian form of apricot, which means albicocca, where literally means white coca. I'm not sure what coca means, but I interpret this as the white flower of the jasmine, right? The jasmine is the city of Damascus, which it's known for. And it makes sense historically as like the Assyrian Empire was one of the dominant powers in the Near East and Levant around the time of the Bronze Age collapse, right? So the time of the Iliad, not that Homer lives in, but the time that Homer's writing about, right? The Bronze Age collapse. The Assyrians, you could argue that they became a little stronger after it due to the collapse of these other powers, right? So maybe this is kind of what they're talking about. So perhaps Damascus is understood as like the center or meridian line that needs to kind of be subdued, or the dividing line of east versus west in the time of Homer in the early Iron Age. Today, Damascus is kind of understood as this center where east and west, because I think Israelites like to think of themselves as like Westerners, as Europeans, and even like Turks want to be considered Europeans, or at least more European than Asian, right? And then, but like Assyrian is considered Middle Eastern or not Western, and east of that, of course, is not considered Western at all. And even in the time of Homer, right, you have this Mycenaean or Doric Greek that is dominant after the Bronze Age collapse, right? The Bronze Age collapse is not necessarily the worst thing. It makes, right, Greece becomes more Doric after, and they're the dominant power in Greece until, like, up until the classic times, and then the Hellenic ages. And then on the east side, you have the Medians or Persians. And they kind of smash into each other during the classical ages. And then, moreover, we could speculate on the etymology of garden as being related to Jordan, like the Jordan River in the country, or just this area in general in the Near East that could have been more fertile in the late Bronze Age or earlier Bronze Age, and into the Iron Age, considered like this Garden of Eden, or just this area that is ruled over, or the center of this area, this kingdom. But also, garden can be taken to mean enclosure, right? The center of the world. The Garden of Eden was known as the center of the world. And that relates to Book 9 and 10 of the Iliad and Exodus, this theme of measuring and designing of a new world, right? This enclosure of languages, religion, commerce. It's nasty stuff, but the garden is like the succession of power, right? It's that nice smelling rose that covers up that decaying stench of democracy, the manure that's needed to fertilize the garden, right? This decay. And chord itself means to cut, which is essentially the next action after measuring, right? It makes sense in Spanish where chord is cortes, to cut, and the courts cut into the power of the central authority, either Agamemnon in the Iliad or Moses in the Hebrew Bible. And the courtyard is the garden, right? So this Jordan. Additionally, in Spanish, Italian, English, there's the word carta, which is associated both with letters as in mail, but also essentially means individual letters, right? As well as maps, cartography. So I wonder if the word carta was derived, or cut, right, was derived or etymologically related to the Carthaginians, and it's making me wonder if Book 9 and Book 10 essentially function as a map, right? It's allowing sailors, merchants, and fishermen the ability to expand and pioneer and circumvent existing trade routes. So moving further to the island of Cythera that's mentioned in the passage, Cythera is associated with the goddess Venus in her birth. So analyzing the name of the place, you could theorize Kythera or Cythera, right? So Kythera would be the more Greek pronunciation. Comes from Kyklo or Cyclo, where we get circle, and Theros is to surround or trap. So I'm thinking it probably comes from fishing, right? To surround and trap the fish. And so you maybe to circle and then trap someone, right? Rhetorically or not. just kind of strategic thinking in terms
of this Athenian, this wartime strategy. It's also a relic of the Neolithic or the Sumerian goddess, I reckon, of fish, where the encircling is mimicking the strategy of like these pelicans or seabirds for attacking the fish below, but also the dialectic, right? These enemies or lower class people in general that need to be subdued. Next is Scandia or Scandia, which is a geographic location in Greece, but also the root scand, so this Skand, is where we get scandalous or scandalos, which is, I don't think, a coincidence when we analyze all the terms as a whole when reading this passage, right? This scandalous. So, especially when you interpret Molos for the Canaanite god Moloch or Molech, which I link to Zeus, right? He transforms into this bull, and he kidnaps Europa, taking her to Crete. So he creates the Phoenician alphabet in Greece, or he brings the Phoenician alphabet to Greece and Europe, and he pretty much brings all the languages. And we can think of this as the process of worshiping Molech, which is the sacrifice of your child or daughter, right? Your daughter is the Europa who's getting taken away by Zeus to create this language or just the European culture, right? This Indo-European linguistic branch. Of course, the worship of Zeus would not be tolerated by Yahweh, this Saturn figure, right? So, and idolatry of Molech is forbidden in Leviticus, and it probably makes sense, right? That perhaps they are afraid of losing their daughters to these kind of European men, or this people who worship Zeus, right? They're losing their religion to people who are worshiping Zeus as the chief god, and it makes sense, right? If you understand Aaron and Levites as these Levantines or Phoenicians, where Zeus abducted Europe, it's like this. They're bringing this Hurrian or this like Hur and Uri, right? It gets bringing in as Europa. It's kind of the same myth, and you see, there's also kind of this difference between the Hebrew and Greek myths, this moralizing and demoralizing, and which one is moralizing, which one is demoralizing. It depends on the audience and the author, right? And the ethnos, basically. Molech is also related to the number 7, like the 7 sentinels set up in Book 9 of the Iliad, and the 70 priests consecrated by Aaron in Exodus. And you could argue Molos, M-O-L-O-S, has a connection with the Latin moles, or mass, heap, pile, which originally means effort or labor, probably like the sacrifice or effort it takes to make the heap or pile. Additionally, the word molos in Greek means a jetway, where again the connection with Athena and seafaring. So going back and plugging in the Greek words with their English definitions, we can decipher this cryptic yet important passage in Book 10 of the Iliad. This crown had been stolen by a wolf out of Hellenes when he broke into the well-defended mountain. He gave it to both sides of Damascus to encircle and trap, to take in scandal, and either side of Damascus gave it as a guest gift to Molech, who gave it to his sons, the Hurrians, and now it was set upon the head of Odysseus. And then maybe just going a little further, we could say, the Princess Helen had been stolen by a wolf when he broke into the well-defended mountain. He gave language to both sides of Damascus to encircle and entrap and to take in scandal, and either side of Damascus gave it as a guest gift to Molech, who gave it to his son, the Hurrians or Europeans, and now it was set upon the head of Odysseus. There's also the story of the Palladium, which is, I reckon, analogy to the passage in the Iliad that I just read, right? They're referencing the same thing. And I've argued before that Odysseus captures Helen, right? I said that Odysseus is with Calypso in the Odyssey. And if I got this just by reading Euripides, right? And Euripides the Cyclops, he pretty much implies that Odysseus has captured Helen. And it's not that it's implied. It's well known that Odysseus and Diomedes are the one who get Helen. But I argue it's done in Book 10. It's not done during this kind of sacking that it's never mentioned, right? The sacking happens in between the Odyssey and the Iliad. So I say it does happen in the Iliad. It happens in Book 10. and it's like this myth of the Palladium. Where here I'll read from the Wikipedia. It says, after Paris's death, Helenus left the city but was captured by Odysseus. The Achaeans somehow managed to persuade the seer warrior to reveal the weakness of Troy. The Achaeans learned from Helenus that Troy would not fall while the Palladium, image or statue of Athena, remained within Troy's walls. The difficult task to stealing this sacred statue again fell upon the shoulders of Odysseus and Diomedes. Odysseus, some say, went by night to Troy, and leaving Diomedes waiting, disguised himself and entered the city as a beggar. There he was recognized by Helen, who told him where the Palladium was. Diomedes then climbed the wall of Troy and entered the city. Together the two friends killed several guards and one or more priests of Athena's temple and stole the Palladium with their blood-stained hands. And they stole the Palladium with their blood-stained hands. Diomedes is generally regarded as the person who physically removed the Palladium and carried it away to the ships. There are several statues and many ancient drawings of him with the Palladium. So, one thing before going on, it's interesting that the statue is like a word that means both something that you craft by Hephaestus or something like this stonemason, but it's also a statue like the law, right? It's Athena is the statue, but she also probably meant the law, that they stole their law. And again, Odysseus is a thief, and it's interesting again that all these kind of cults, Hephaestus, Athena, and Hermes, work together, right? And while they're not always mentioned, you can figure it out through the symbology and the language. And then going further, compare this to the Hebrew Bible. This is like in the book of Joshua, where the spies go ahead to meet the prostitute Rahab in Jericho, and she agrees to help the Israelites sack Jericho by placing the scarlet cloth on the roof. And she also hides the spies too, right? So we can say that Helen has helped the Greeks sack Troy, and Odysseus takes her as a queen, it seems, after, and she's the language, right? And they use the language to encircle Damascus, or control the left and right of Damascus. And Pallas Athena comes to Greece, and Athens is founded as a result of this. It would make sense the social justice god and fisherman god and sailor god and pirate plunder god, this strategos, right? The strategos god is related also to prostitution, right? Because sailors are synonymous with prostitutions. If you've ever met somebody in the Navy, like an old Navy guy, and soldiers too. And we have to remember, she's a social justice goddess. So that term can mean whatever. Obviously, it can be perverted or it can be used as a sword and shield for your own good. But her symbolism is that she's blind, right? You can sail at night. She's the rudder, but she's also the language bringer, or you have to be the language in the law, right? She's the statues of the law. Or you have to be a good scribe or scholar to understand the languages and charts, like a lawyer. Odysseus is the descendant of Hermes, right? He's the translator, and he's loved also by Athena, the scholar, and this pirate goddess, right? All these seemingly disparate or different cults work together. They interface, and at that intersection, they kind of make the myth, right? But you could go and just understand the passage as the manufactured dialectic, right? And it's the mainstream media through the naming convention and structure of the sentences. It's about creating letters, words, and language, building blocks of this classical Athenian Greece, right? It's the pillars of logos that prop up the democracy and the religion itself. Whether the democracy is a function of the religion or vice versa, that's up for argument, I guess. I think the story goes, though, that the Egyptian and Minoans, or early Mycenaean linear script, is transformed into this Proto-Greek that allows for the Phoenicians or Levantine merchants to engross themselves and dominate commerce, right, in these earlier pre-Homer civilizations, right? So the Egyptians and Minoans and even the earlier Mycenaeans had script, and even the Minoans and Mycenaeans had a somewhat linear script, but that was taken by the Phoenicians, and then they created this kind of phonetic language, right? And then that phonetic language was taken to Europe. So it's kind of like this, it's kind of three phases, right? So that's like the beginning of the Trojan War, this push west to east, right? The Greeks are Israelites going east, right? The Greeks go east to Anatolia and somewhat north, And then the Israelites go east and somewhat north too in the Exodus. There they steal the riches of this eastern civilization, and that's kind of like this language, law, and craftsmanship. And then they take it back, right? And we know in the Greek myths as Zeus abducting Europa. But the Hebrews censored and whittled away their myths to just Yahweh, right? They composed it into this composite god, Saturn, that we know in Roman mythology. And Diomedes is the new master and commander of the seas. He's stolen Pallas Athena, and Odysseus, he gets the crown, right? We know Odysseus in the Odyssey, he's like Jesus or Peter or something. He's like the king, right, of this new language, this logos.
And Diomedes is like a pirate because he goes, or sorry. And Odysseus is a descendant of Hermes. He's kind of like a pirate because when they go out with Diomedes on this secret spy mission, they pray to Athena to guide and protect him on their mission to spy on the Trojans, right? And Athena sends them a heron, which is similar to a pelican, and it's also like this parrot on his shoulder. he's literally like a pirate, how we think of a pirate today, except this time they're on land, and it seems Athena has kind of taken on a new role representing the strategic intelligence, or the FBI, or like the CIA of Mount Olympus. But the older mythos is still there, like all the Iliad, right? This kind of blocks of the Neolithic, these old hymns and prayers, and also where we get their epithets, right? The hymns was where we get their epithets and symbology, and it wouldn't make sense. The myths wouldn't be coherent. It wouldn't make sense without these blocks that are already in there. But whether Athena was ever worshipped as a goddess of fishermen or birds and fish, it's not certain. But I'm thinking that, yes, she was, and it's kind of hints of it that may just be left over from the earlier Bronze Age and Neolithic. And then it's also, as it comes west, they've identified similar gods, right, from the leftover older Minoan civilizations and stuff, and they've syncretized it or formed it into this Athena god, right? They've consciously created her. Because going back to the seven sentinels in Book 9 of the Iliad, Aphareus, the belly fin of the tuna, he's the ability to steer in the dark, right? He's the education, the maps, the language, the myths, right? It's you defining the world, you shining light on the world, right? This education. And Athena personifies this, the strategy. And also, going back, this maritime prowess. But even today, it's still, you need to be able to park aircraft carrier out in like the Persian Gulf, right? That's how we think of Athena. She is kind of like that Navy prowess, but she also, underneath her, she has like these CIA, Navy SEALs, or FBI intelligence agents working for her, like Odysseus and Diomedes. And together, she's kind of like this Leviathan of the whole intelligence and justice department, right? This whole system, this Leviathan. But it would make sense that Athena, this goddess of strategos and warfare, plunder, would be preyed to by people in boats, like pirates. And we can imagine Odysseus and Diomedes, right? When the heron comes down, it's like the pelican, the sign of Nanchi, the Sumerian goddess, and we associate the owl also with Athena. Just birds in general, but also fish. Again, it goes back to this bird and fish, this training scribal poem that doesn't seem that important, but it really is. And comparing to the Hebrew Bible, this part of Book 10, once again, I interpret as the story of Joshua and Caleb spying on the Canaanites that is told in the book of Numbers, chapter 13. And like Odysseus and Diomedes praying to Athena and setting up this mini shrine or altar to her, it's similar to Caleb and Joshua coming back because blessed by God, because they're the only ones who prayed, right, or believed in God. And again, the Bible is more ambiguous about her, specifically whether her in Exodus is the same her, the father of Caleb, in the book of Numbers. It could just be that with the patronymic naming devices that you can mention multiple generations in one name. But also I interpret it that the Hebrew Bible was heavily censored, but it's also kind of confusing in its esoteric way, right? That it's meant to confuse and be mysterious. That one way you do that is through just changing the languages, right? Back at the Trojan camp, Hector orders all his princes together for a council, and then he asks one of the gathered to volunteer to go on a recon mission. Just like the one of
the one the Greeks are attempting, right? Like it's like the opposite. But Hector again, it's the opposite, but they're the conservatives, so they're the losers, right? And there's a guy, he's called Dolon, who comes forward with the promise of great reward if he returned with valuable knowledge of the Greeks. And Dolon, or Dolos, means deceitful, and that Dolon will attempt to sell out the Trojan, and he's a liar, right? He's a weasel. And then Odysseus and Diomedes spot Dolon easily, right? And they end up interrogating him about the Trojans, and then they promise to let him go, but they really just want information. Again, Dolon is deceitful, he's a weasel, and the guy represents the losing side of the conservative argument that comes forward. He's always going to be deceitful and lie and lose. And then the other side of that is that they don't really care. They just want information, right? So they kill him, and after that, Thrasymedes goes and kills 12 Thracians, right? And then 13 being the king. So we can think of this, again, Thrasymedes as this conquering of Thrace by the Median Empire and the rise of the Mithra-Median Empire that will come to be known as the Persians, that they'll eventually come and try to conquer Greece, right? And they'll smash into each other. Eventually, with the guidance of Athena, Diomed and Odysseus make it back to the Greek camp, and it's Nestor, the high priest figure, who hears them first, right? He's the first to get the news. And then they go and wash their feet in the oceans, and then anoint themselves in oil, and then making offerings. And it's kind of like Exodus. They have this altar of incense, and then the washing basin, and then the slaughtering of animals during their mission.